The BBC's coverage of the Israel-Hamas conflict has again come under scrutiny after the corporation apologised for falsely reporting that the IDF, the Israel Defence Force, targeted medical staff in Gaza. Now, the controversy is only the latest in a long line of incidents that's blighted the Beeb's coverage of the war, leading to protests outside of Broadcasting House, including the initial refusal to call Hamas terrorists, an act often mocking on viral Israel comedy shows every week, it seems now, that they're doing that, and they're quite good, actually, unlike BBC comedy, it has to be said. Well, joining me now to discuss this is Gary Mond, Chairman of the National Jewish Assembly. Gary, thank you very much for your time today.
Thank you for having me.
I mean, I would argue that actually watching some of the clips that are put out of the BBC and going through the Jewish Chronicle to actually read other publications are available, actually looking at the facts of what they got wrong, you would argue that they're about as balanced as a one-legged, tightrope walker. It's quite extraordinary.
I think the first thing to say is this is a historic problem. It is not just since the war began on October the 7th.
For the BBC specifically.
For the BBC specifically. There's been many, many occasions in the past when if there's an attack on Israel from a terrorist group like Hamas, it's very much downplayed. But when Israel responds, all of a sudden, the BBC swing into action and we see severe criticism of the Israelis who have always been acting in self-defence. And I must stress, this goes well before the war. It's not just the last 6 weeks. And then, of course, we had the incidents in the war that everyone's aware of. For example, that their refusal to call Hamas a terrorist organisation. And my own view, actually, is terrorist organisation isn't actually strong enough. They should be called a genocidal terrorist organisation. They're not like the IRA. The IRA never had the plan to murder every single Christian in Britain, whereas Hamas has a plan to murder every single Jew, not just in Israel, but elsewhere as well.
Now, would you, I guess there are two questions from that. First of all, a personal one, if you wouldn't mind. Do you think actually that the London itself, one, do you feel safe in London, right? Do you think actually the members feel safe in London? And secondly, do you think actually the BBC has got a part to play in making life better for Jews in Britain?
I think many members of the Jewish community do not feel safe at the moment. They're living in a state of fear, in some cases even terror, and it's getting to the point where quite a number are thinking of whether they should go and live somewhere else. Mm-hmm. Britain is particularly bad in Europe. At least in France and Germany, these marches have been banned. The terror marches that have been taking place every Saturday, organised by the so-called pro-Palestinian groups, when, of course, they're really just anti-Israel or even anti-Semitic groups, is really getting to many, many people.
Yeah. And then I guess the question from that would be, do you actually lay blame at not exclusively at the BBC's door, but partly?
Oh, certainly partly, yes.
And elaborate on that. What is it that right now, since this October 7th...
And here, it's not just the BBC, Sky News as well, and one or two other outlets. When you actually see bias coming from the media, which you know is unfair, you start to think, what about many, many people in this country who have never really held a view either way on the issue of Israel? They watch the BBC and they start to form opinions. And those opinions are totally unfairly negative about Israel. That's where the blame on the BBC lies.
Because I can think of a few examples. Obviously, you've mentioned one already, the failure to call Hamas terrorists, when they're a prescribed terrorist organisation here in Britain.
Absolutely.
So they should be, our national broadcaster should be calling them that. I think that was a terrible editorial decision. Then, secondly, there was when the hospital...
Yes, exactly.
And the rocket had gone off behind the hospital, and actually it was...
And in a matter of minutes, the BBC blamed the Israeli army, the Israeli Air Force, and yet the truth of the matter came out a few hours later that it was actually a misfired, or I'm not sure it was misfired, but certainly a rocket fired by a Palestinian terrorist organisation.
I mean, arguably not meant to hit the hospital, but, still Hamas all the same. And thirdly, the BBC's Orla Gurin, in a masterstroke of omission, she neglected to actually mention that the IDF was delivering fuel to Gaza hospitals, and I believe that was the Al-Shifa hospital.
Yes, that's correct.
So So there are a load of things where this always starts, as conflicts in the Middle East do, starts to get confusing very quickly. And I'm afraid to say that the BBC ain't helping matters.
Well, bias shows itself in many different ways, whether it's omission of something that paints Israel in a good light, or whether it's essentially misreporting facts concerning actions that Israel may take. There are multitudes of ways where bias can be shown. And I'm afraid the BBC has been doing that for years. And I must emphasise, this is not a matter that began on October the 7th.
Did the BBC have you on?
I have been on the Jeremy Vine show with John Simpson on one occasion a few weeks ago. I'm hoping they're going to have me on again.
And John Simpson, how did that go?
It went OK, and I was also interviewed by GB News with John Sargent a few weeks ago.
Yeah. I mean, are you grateful then, dare I say, for the broadcasting landscape being somewhat more competitive than it used to be? Because at one point it would have been, you know, the BBC.
I believe in the free. I mean, outside Jewish matters, I believe in free markets, and I strongly support GB News and other independent news channels in their quest to be successful.
Because I get emails. In the Northeast, I live in quite a Jewish community, and I had a message from a woman, I don't know her, and she said, "Thank you so much for what you've been saying, because I genuinely feel unsafe being here." And do you know, I found that really quite difficult to comprehend, because it just seems so alien to most of us who aren't Jewish. And the fact that there are people who genuinely believe that they may have to leave the country because of the direction that we're going in, that's deeply troubling for so many of us.
Put yourself in the shoes of a Jewish person who finds themselves constantly witnessing these vast marches of what can only be described as Jew hatred. I think that the people who participate in the march, a mixture of two types of people. One is the absolute blatant anti-Semites, who might be fundamentalist Islamists, or they might be just extreme left-wing Corbynistas. And then you've got a second group in the marches who tend to be more naive and gullible people who've essentially just followed on from the latest trend. And it's that second group that have been particularly influenced adversely by the BBC.
Well, we did contact the BBC for a response. We are awaiting a response, Gary.
Yes.
But I just finally, and very briefly, if you would, I apologise for that, but do you actually think that the support that Israel has maintained from the international community thus far, do you see that continuing? And do you see actually the entire premise of the debate, the arguments, the rhetoric, what's taking place on our streets? There are demonstrations all day today, for example. Do you see this getting nastier here in Britain and the media reporting of it becoming more challenging for the state of Israel?
Firstly, I think the message from the international community is very simple. I would say to them, let Israel finish the job. What Israel is doing to finish off Hamas or to try to eradicate them is in everyone's interest, not just Israel's interest, because they are a fundamentalist Islamist organisation. And it's the viewpoint, the old viewpoint, first the Saturday people, then the Sunday people. We go for the Jews first and we go for the Christians next. It's in everyone's interest that Israel is successful. And I say to the international community, hands off Israel. Let Benjamin Netanyahu and his government finish the job. That's the first point. And the second point, really, regarding the community here, we're going to get quite more support than I thought from the non-Jewish community. I'm speaking tomorrow at a demonstration called Never Again, which is run by Christian Action Against Anti-Semitism. And we're expecting 10 to 15,000 people outside Downing Street.
Brilliant. Oh, well, brilliant.
One of the few Jewish speakers. Most of the speakers are Christians.
Right. Yeah. Well, Gary Mond, chairman of the National Jewish Assembly, thank you very much for your time.
Thank you, Darren, for having me.